The Renewal, written and read by Christopher Halton. It was a tragedy that Miles Jefferson lost his childhood sweetheart Maria in a drowning accident when she was 20. A life that they had planned together had been taken away so cruelly, and in Miles's mind he felt a responsibility as he drove her to the beach for a day's fun, swimming and sunbathing, where she later died. Despite the efforts of a lifeguard and a doctor relaxing nearby on that hot July day in 1930, nothing could be done after her lifeless body was dragged from the water. And for 5 more years he lived in self-recrimination, thinking over and over how things would have been different if they had been settled with a home filled with the joy of the 2 children they had planned together. But all that had changed when, on a business trip to Budapest, he met a Hungarian beauty named Zsófia Almássy, the daughter of a count who held an estate at Vafalvi Castle in a former Hungarian region of Transylvania. Zsófia was around 30 years old. Tall, slim, with a dark complexion, and beautiful cat-like eyes whose darkness gave an alluring beauty to her finely boned face and body. Her thick raven-coloured hair trailed down her shoulders, and she had a look of wildness about her that suggested an independent, free-spirited woman. Coupled with the fact that she dressed well and was highly intelligent, there was no doubt in his mind that she would be a fine catch as a wife. Miles was in Budapest to secure a contract to install power generators for an engineering company based in that country. In this endeavour he successfully obtained a signed agreement, which was then returned to London by courier. Finding that he had a month to spare, he was invited by Zsófia to join her and her father, Count Almássy, for a short holiday on the family estate, which was nestled in a shielded valley deep in the Carpathian mountains. As it was June, the weather was hot and sunny as he drove along the mountainous hairpin bends to descend deep into the valley, where eventually he arrived at the castle, which was in reality a fine Baroque house surrounded by a small moat. At Zsófia's instruction, he drove across a stone bridge, which led him into a courtyard surrounded by high walls with numerous windows. He could see as he parked that the building's allusion to a castle was its 4 towers, which centuries ago would have been the bastions of a citadel-like structure to defend the valley from the onslaught of the Ottoman army. As he parked, Zsófia emerged from the castle down some stone steps from 2 grand-looking double doors, which were crested by her family's coat of arms. She was a sight to behold, wearing a mid-calf day dress in a soft wool crepe, fitted at the waist with a narrow belt. Over her shoulders she wore a feminine tweed jacket and a felt cloche hat. The rich rouge lipstick provided a fitting contrast to her face. She looked as she was, an exquisite beauty of good breeding and impeccable taste. In comparison, Miles felt dressed down, wearing brown trousers, a white shirt and a grey cardigan, with a brown trilby hat perched on his head at a jaunty angle, a pipe clenched between his teeth. He climbed out of his low-slung MG sports car, whereupon both hugged and kissed each other's cheeks. With a huge smile and a thick Hungarian accent, she said, "Let me help you, my dear Miles," as she, with a footman, helped him carry his luggage into the castle. Inside, he was greeted by her waiting father, the Count, who warmly shook his hand and spoke briefly to him in Hungarian. Zsófia, looking at her father and then at Miles, said embarrassedly, "Please forgive my father, he knows no English. He says it is a great honour for him that you have come." Miles smiled in return and the Count bowed his head. All 3 then went to a beautiful Baroque lounge, where a manservant poured a glass of Hungarian bull's blood wine, which they then took while sitting on some finely upholstered, comfortable berger-padded chairs, which in themselves added grace and elegance to this stunning room. And so they sat well into the late afternoon, regaled by the Count about the rich history of the area and their famous ancestors, who had fought against the Ottomans to preserve it. Here is the conversational text in English, without the need for translation. The Count proudly explained that one ancestor, who in particular stood out against all others for his brutality, which was in vengeance for the murder of his wife, the Countess Erzsébet, and her servants, who in 1672 were caught unawares by an Ottoman raiding party outside the castle in its then palatial grounds. All were brutally murdered, and her husband, Count Attila, who was away, returned later to the devastating scene and swore death to those responsible. It was said that he raised his own army and fought in battle 1,000 Ottomans led by Tahir Pasha al-Nasir, a particularly ruthless leader, and slaughtered 800 of them, with the 200 survivors, including Tahir Pasha al-Nasir, who were led in chains back to the castle estate. All his men were crucified alive on wooden crosses in an inverted position on the approach road entrance into the valley, with Tahir Pasha al-Nasir slowly tortured to death in the castle dungeon. Those on crosses later became food for carrion, and their later skeletons were left as a warning to anyone who wanted war with the Count. Tahir Pasha al-Nasir was never seen again. The Count, lavishing every detail, reached the end of his story, with the dark brooding seriousness of the storyteller breaking into laughter, and said, "A very good story, eh?" He then showed Miles a painting in the hallway of a young Count Attila, dressed in armour on horseback, with Ottoman soldiers being slain by his men in the background. This Count certainly looked fearsome, and he thought, not the person you would want to meet under any circumstances, whether in peace or war. After the pleasantries of being shown around the spacious castle and its grounds, he was shown to his room by the beautiful Zsófia, and upon entry he was rather pleased with its position, having a window that looked out over the forested estate, with a ridge of the Carpathian mountains in the background. With its own ensuite, the room, like the rest of the castle, was well maintained, and in the Baroque style, which was popular in Transylvania. Miles was assigned his own servant, who ensured that his dinner suit was neatly laid out, and that the rest of his clothes were placed inside a beautiful mahogany armoire wardrobe. Having later dressed for dinner, he joined the Count and his daughter in the dining room. Dinner was a delightful yet formal affair, graced by the beautiful Zsófia, who was dressed elegantly in a beautiful Parisienne-style, floor-length evening gown of pale ivory silk satin. The fabric rippled fluidly with every movement, and on her frame it fitted sinuously and gracefully. Her hair was gathered smoothly at the nape of her neck and rolled into a knot. This was adorned with a small tiara and a small diamond necklace around her neck. She looked every inch a gentlewoman of the old school. The Count himself, like Miles, wore a conventional dinner suit, and dinner was a formal three-course affair that took them well into the evening. It was clear that the Count and his daughter enjoyed the company of their English guest, and Miles had no doubt that his stay would always remind him of a fairy tale affair in the company of these two interesting people, and he was sure that he had caught the romantic eye of Zsófia, whose beauty was matched by her own vibrant personality. Never had he felt so happier in his life. After retiring to bed later that evening, Miles, happy and content, fell into a deep slumber, and for the first time in many months he had the strangest of dreams. In it he saw his dearly loved Maria, who was pleading with him, but for what, he did not know. She appeared frantic and was screaming, and tears were in her eyes and an expectation of urgency. Yet he could not understand why, and upon waking in a cold sweat at 3 a.m., he turned on his bedside lamp and sat confused over the nature of the dream. Or was it perhaps something more sinister, a warning? He sat in bed, mulling over and over the detail. He lit and smoked a cigarette, deciding that it was due to his own divided loyalty between his former love and the wonderful Zsófia. It was, he reasoned, nothing but buried guilt manifesting itself again for the first time in many years. He turned off the bedside lamp and returned to sleep without further interruption. That morning he dressed in a hacking jacket, a white shirt and jodhpurs for a promised ride with Zsófia around the large castle estate. After breakfast and having borrowed a set of black riding boots, they went for a ride together through a twisting trail that followed a track alongside a small river that flowed through the valley. The day was sunny and warm and the air felt fresh and clean, unlike living in a busy city like London or Budapest. After 1 hour they arrived at a log-built wooden lodge, which was used on the estate as a stopover for visitors walking the trail. Having tied up their horses, they went inside, where they rested at a large wooden trestle table and chairs. Zsófia went into an adjoining room and returned with a samovar from which she lit and boiled water to make black tea, while they both chatted about their respective lives. Zsófia admitted that she was an infrequent visitor to the estate, as she worked as a journalist for several Parisian newspapers and magazines. Being fluent in several languages helped her work as a writer, and in one journal she had a regular column on Hungarian cuisine. When they met, she was on an assignment in Bucharest, which allowed her to return home to the castle. Both sitting opposite each other, she reached her hands across the table and gently grasped Miles while she looked passionately in his eyes. "My dear Miles, I have to tell you that I am quite infatuated by you. I have never mentioned this to you before, as I am fearful that being too forward would jeopardize the possibility of us being together. I feel," and she paused hesitantly, "that you might reject me." Miles's heart jumped for joy, as he too felt very much the same way about Zsófia. "My dearest Zsófia, you are to me a very special lady, regardless of whether or not your family owned a castle and an estate. You are everything." She smiled, and moistness appeared in her eyes as she caressed his hands and leaned over to kiss him. "My dear Miles," she replied, "you will never not be without me, that I am sure." After spending the rest of the day together, they later rode back to the castle, where they spent the evening in the lounge with her father, a rather striking figure, it must be said, with thinning pepper-grey hair that was swept back. He bore little semblance to Zsófia, and had rather craggy features and a sharp nose. He was clean-shaven and of slimish build, and aged around 65. He was, in every respect, a man of noble appearance. Having had an enjoyable day and evening in their company, he retired to bed earlier, as the day's activities had worn him out. He was immensely happy with his new life and never wanted to return home to England. Once in bed, he was soon fast asleep. But again, Miles was visited by his lost love, Maria. This time, she sounded much clearer, as though speaking from a distance. Her voice was stronger and more emphatic. This time she was frantic and seemed to be shouting, although her words were faint and mostly indistinct. But Miles could see she was waving him away. But to where? And why? He felt sure he heard Zsófia's name, but nothing more. Again he awoke, and again he reconciled himself to the nature of the dream, quickly returning to his slumbers. The following day, and after breakfast, Zsófia said, "Would you like to visit our little black museum, Miles? I never mentioned it previously because I find it too horrific, and was afraid that in some way you might feel it reflects on us." He was really intrigued, and without a second thought agreed to join her. They descended a flight of stone steps from the hall, which echoed every sound their bodies made on the way down, from the clinking of keys in Zsófia's hands to the sound of their shoes. As they plunged into darkness, Zsófia turned on a brown bakelite light switch, and he could see ahead a grim-looking dark stone passageway, glistening with dampness, which reflected the crudely cut stonework in the shadows cast by the electric light. On the walls were unlit, old-fashioned wrought-iron torches, and the feeling of evil and dread was palpable. The passageway led in a few feet to a heavy oak door, which was crudely studded with iron, hand-forged rivets, and fitted with a heavy wrought-iron door lock. Zsófia opened it with a huge key. The door, rather predictably perhaps, groaned as it opened, and inside was a darkened chamber that lit up into a large dungeon when the light switch was turned on. Zsófia was right. It was a black museum of horrors, with stretching racks, iron maidens, a forge for heating torture implements, and manacles on the wall. Also, he saw a giant axe on a pendulum that lowered as it swung over a prisoner tied to a board. "My God, who on earth collected these?" Zsófia replied in a matter-of-fact voice. "They have been here since the 12th century, but were put to use mainly by my ancestor, Count Attila, for interrogating and torturing the Ottomans." "Your ancestor was rather a bloodthirsty chap, and his revenge against the Ottomans reminds me much of Vlad Tepes, who shared the same hatred." "Oh yes, but Attila never harmed any of his own countrymen," she replied. Having finished his tour of this depressing dungeon, they returned to the ground floor for some much-needed refreshments, which in Miles's case was a good brandy. After they finished, having sat out on a warm and sunny veranda, Zsófia said, "I have one more surprise for you, Miles, and that too might shock you." A chill went down Miles's spine as he was reminded of his dream with Maria. Zsófia could see that he was shocked, but she laughed and said dryly, "Don't worry, my dear, I don't plan to have you tortured." Miles laughed in relief as Zsófia took him to a wing in the castle, which was her family's private quarters. As they entered a gallery room, Miles could see many portraits going back many centuries, and there was one he recognized immediately. It was a 17th century portrait of a fine lady riding side saddle on a horse, and the resemblance to Zsófia was to say very striking. "That is the Countess Erzsébet, whom the Ottomans murdered." Miles excitedly replied, "That is incredible, and she is depicted in the portrait around the same age as you." "Yes, it must be in the genes," she laughed. "It is a kind of creepy though, my dearest Zsófia, you must agree." She smiled in agreement, and they left the gallery, having studied numerous portraits of her family members. Although accepting such resemblances to be very odd, Miles knew or had heard of similar circumstances, and in a way felt privileged to be associated with someone who represents, as it were, living history. The Count himself was nowhere to be seen that day, according to Zsófia. He was away for a few days in Budapest on business, but he hoped to see them both soon. The next few days passed without incident, although the dreams of Maria seemed to gather a crescendo, with her appearing more frantic and concerned than ever, and finally, in one dream, the words, "Leave now," were audibly clear in his mind. By this time, Miles was far too besotted with the beautiful Zsófia for him to take any notice of. He was in love with her, and she with him, for Maria to make any difference. One evening, Zsófia took Miles into the library, a large room lined with old oak bookcases which had turned a rich brown with age. The smell of old wood and the many ancient leather-backed tomes in their cases permeated an odour that Miles knew too well from his studies at Oxford. She poured herself and Miles a glass of brandy, and after both sipped their drinks, she invited Miles to sit at a reading table, while she carefully removed one old book from a bookcase, which she laid out on the table in front of Miles. She then proceeded to flick through the pages before eventually stopping at a paragraph entitled Migratio animae per ligationem spirituum. Zsófia, leaning over the back of the seated Miles, said, "Tell me, my darling, have you ever heard of metempsychosis?" Miles, puzzled as to whatever this was all about, said, "I vaguely remember hearing about this at university during a philosophy lecture. It really is a lot of nonsense concerning the transmigration of the soul. Why do you ask?" She continued, "In front of you is a Latin book entitled De Magia by the scholar Giordano Bruno. It was published in the 1590s, and this edition is the only known version, as it explores the possibility of binding human souls into other bodies or forms. This version of the book condemned him to death as a heretic, and he was burned at the stake in Rome in 1600 AD. This copy was, in fact, stolen from the Vatican Library, and it is the ritual and occult magic in this book that has kept my husband, Count Attila Almássy, and me alive since the 17th century. At first Miles chuckled, thinking not unnaturally that this was a joke, but he soon realized that although he could still speak, he no longer had movement in his arms and legs. Petrified and terrified at the discovery, he said in a weakening voice, "What have you done to me, Zsófia? I cannot move." Zsófia smiled. "Don't worry, my dear, the Count is old and needs your body to thrive again. You always desired me, and now you shall have me, as his soul takes yours. For I am Zsófia Almássy. My metamorphosis took place 2 years ago. This body was once a servant girl." Just then the old Count wandered into the room, appearing weaker and more feeble than he was since Miles saw him. He sat at the table with Miles and turned and smiled. Miles, realizing that now his speech was getting weaker and weaker, asked if the massacre of the Ottomans was a lie, as was her death. She replied, "I did die, that is true, but my husband revived me and set the condition by which we both survive together, so long as there are people like you, my dear, who are prey for our renewal." As he listened, his eyes grew heavy and tired, and before him he saw his lost love, Maria, who could only stand with outstretched arms to welcome his soul as it departed his body. They were soon gone, while the now younger and handsome Count left the library, hand in hand with the beautiful Countess Zsófia Almássy. Two reunited in death, while the Count and the Countess were reunited in their quest for eternal life. The end.